Hi everyone. Today what we're going to do is wrap up the last few pages of the Deviance chapter, and in doing so we'll be looking at the social construction of social problems. So we started the Deviance chapter by just recognizing that deviance is something that is relative. What one person considers deviant, another person may consider normal. Over time, ideas of normality and deviance change, and ideas of normality and deviance change from place to place as well. And we also talked about how deviance is not, from a kind of symbolic interactionist perspective, deviance is not inherent. In other words, whether it be a behavior or some type of characteristic, it doesn't inherently possess deviance. A deviance is something that people socially create. So we make something, we make a behavior deviant, we make an attribute deviant. And again, because it's relative, that deviance can change over time. What we constructed to be deviance one time period may not be deviant in another. And we talked about how people, think about deviance. Do we think that the deviant person is a bad person as a whole, kind of that internal perspective, or do we attribute the deviance to a more social level where we recognize kind of these social structures in play that perhaps promote the deviance going on? And when we look at things socially, we're more likely to try to change the situation. And when we look at things individually, we're more likely to try to change, try to correct the individual. So finally, we talked about how people tend to navigate the deviant identity. So oftentimes people will try to, pass as normal, kind of in public spaces, try to, hide the deviant attributes or try to hide the deviant behavior. Sometimes what you do is basically divide your worlds up. You do your deviance in some spaces, but you don't do it in other spaces. And then we talked about how people can use a lot of denial mechanisms. You deny that you're hurting yourself, you deny that you're hurting other people, and you have all these other strategies you do basically to see yourself as somebody who's normal, while other people are seeing you as somebody who's a deviant. So that's kind of the first part of the deviant chapter, the major ideas being discussed. And now this last aspect, it gets into the construction of social problems. So here it's interesting that this doesn't have an entire chapter dedicated to itself because deconstruction of social problems is a big topic within symbolic interactionism. So, here we kind of see social deviance being taken up a level where it's not just kind of a deviant behavior, but it's a problem for society as a whole. And like I mentioned before, this is kind of a larger area of study within symbolic interactionism. And we're going to be going over an article in a few weeks that kind of touches on the social construction of social problems. So getting into this, the book kind of puts out there three different questions that relate to the construction of social problems. First, why are some behaviors defined as problematic, while other behaviors equally threatening are seen as normal? Why do some issues become regarded as social problems? Why some issues get ignored? So basically, sometimes we have a social problem, but something that's just as problematic is seen as normal. And then sometimes we have a social problem and something that's just as problematic we ignore. We basically don't even recognize. And then finally, who has the power to make these definitions stick, to create the social problem? Who has the authority, who has the legitimacy to make something a problem, perhaps make something normal or make something be ignored as a whole? And this gets back into Howard Becker's book, Outsiders, when he talked about kind of the rule creators and the rule enforcers. Those concepts can definitely be applied here as well. So basically what I wanted to do with the last, 4 or 5 pages of the chapter is just break it down here and then apply the ideas to another issue, looking at kind of COVID-19 as a social issue, a social problem or not. So when looking at drug scares and terrorism, these are two different topics, two kind of current social issues that they broke down in the book with reference to creating a social problem. So first, you need institutions to promote a culture that defines something as problematic rather than defining it as normal, or rather than a culture that simply ignores it as a whole. So we're looking at drug scares and terrorism. And basically, you have the media and you have certain politicians that will promote a culture saying that terrorism is the number one issue right now, or perhaps other issues are more important when it comes to social problems in the United States. Or when you look at drug scares, throughout history, how we tend to, overdo it in terms of the harm that's being done, the potential harm that could be done when it comes to using certain drugs, whether it be marijuana, crack cocaine, so on and so on. So we have, the media, politicians promoting culture. And it's not all media, it's not all politicians, but it's kind of a large enough group of the media players and politicians that can promote a culture, make it part of the popular culture. And you have what we call kind of claims makers, kind of those who are actually kind of leading the institutions, or leading kind of other institutions. And these claims makers are often people we give some type of legitimacy. And we give them legitimacy based upon their positions of authority, their credentials that they possess. So we're more likely to listen to a medical worker or a politician when it comes to something than listen to somebody who doesn't have the congressperson label or doesn't have the MD after their name. So you have these claims makers, people that have these positions of authority, and going back to terrorism, people in homeland security, and we kind of take their thoughts seriously compared to other thoughts that are out there. And what their claims, they claim that something is a problem. They start to kind of reinforce the culture. They help kind of build that culture that defines the drug scare or the terrorism as problematic. And then we get into kind of the cultural conflicts that are involved. So there's always kind of what I call a double othering, kind of try to other a culture, and you other kind of people often connected to that culture in a way to say kind of this is the bad going on and this is what we need to try to get rid of. And so what the drug scares, it was kind of this counterculture going on in the 60s and 70s that people looked at as being kind of non-productive, and basically, a bunch of people who didn't want to go through the normal channels of society. They were dropping out of school. They didn't want to work the normal 9-to-5 jobs. And so this counterculture was seen as kind of this culture that somehow contaminating kind of the American culture as a whole. And then when you go to the cultural conflict being highlighted for terrorism, basically you're looking at kind of non-Western cultures, kind of this kind of blanket idea. These are kind of the cultures that are interfering with trying to change the American lifestyle as a whole. And then you have kind of the people, again, often connected to those cultures, directly or indirectly. For the drug scares, typically they use kind of poor racial minorities to stigmatize and kind of show as the bad people involved. And then the terrorism, typically you're looking at kind of religious minorities with reference to the religious majority of the United States. And so those are kind of the specific people that you kind of identify as the troublemakers, the bad people, and they're connected to that kind of culture as a whole, and that you're conflicting with and trying to kind of get rid of. And again, it's those claims makers that are kind of promoting all this, promoting the cultural conflict, promoting the stigmatization of people. And then you have those institutions in which you see the doctors, you see the politicians, the media, and government as a whole that promote the issue as a social problem. So again, it's basically, you can apply any type of social problem to this. You'll see the people, the institutions promoting the culture that defines it as a problem. Then you see those specific people, the claims makers within it, that are kind of doing the dirty work, making sure that people are kind of being exposed to this culture. and then kind of the overall cultural conflict, the conflict with the counterculture or the religious cultures, and then the actual people, the religious minorities in the United States, and then the racial minorities within the United States. And so, the idea basically is, it doesn't have to be kind of a problem, at least with a capital P. So we're not trying to say that, drug use is not problematic, because it is. But often it's with a kind of lowercase p. It's not as big as an issue compared to other issues, such as poverty. Poverty is much bigger a social problem compared to drug scares, but it doesn't get the attention that perhaps it deserves. We don't construct it as such. And the same thing with terrorism. We're not trying to downplay terrorism as being problematic. But again, we have other social problems that are maybe with a capital P in the United States that do more harm to American life, American people, compared to terrorism. So the question is, why does drug scare, why does terrorism get all the attention? We tend to ignore, we tend to minimize other problems that are just as problematic, if not more. So finally, basically applying the same framework to COVID-19 as a social problem. So on the one hand, you see where it's constructed as not a problem, no problem. And then on the other hand, you see where it is constructed as a problem, as a social issue that needs attention. And so promoting the culture, you basically on both sides of the coin, you see the media and politicians. So certain media sources, like Fox News, for example, they typically downplay the problematic nature of COVID-19, where other media sources, CNN typically people use, but also PBS, they pay more mind, they pay more attention to COVID-19 as a social problem. And then you have politicians, again, it's not this black and white, but usually you see kind of the more conservative politicians downplaying the issue. And then you see more of the progressive politicians outplaying the issue. So again, you're promoting the culture on the one hand, that's saying it's not a problem, don't make it a bigger issue than it is. And then you see on the other hand, a culture being promoted that's saying it is problematic. We do need to pay attention to this, a social problem with a capital P. So again, kind of within those institutions, you have the claims makers, you see the medical experts, being interviewed on TV, being brought to Congress to testify about it is problematic, or perhaps it is not. We're overblowing the situation. You have the politicians themselves that go out and speak about an issue, being an issue or being perhaps not an issue. And then you start to see those who are trying to, the claims makers, promoting that culture of social problem. They often talk to victims, bring victims into the conversation, and the victims themselves. They've been through COVID-19. They've lost a family member due to COVID-19. They use the victims as claims makers to kind of support their point of view, their definition of the situation. And on the other side, a lot of people will reference conspiracy theorists today to talk about how it's not a social problem. What's really going on is, whatever the conspiracy may be. So again, kind of downplaying the situation by saying, you guys are all being fooled. I'm the smartest person in the room because I can see the conspiracy, and everybody else is an idiot because they can't see it. So again, you have these different claims makers going on that's saying it is an issue, or perhaps it's not. The cultural conflict tends to be framed in terms of kind of a liberal left. The liberal left is trying to make this issue bigger than it is. They're trying to make this issue something because they have an alternative agenda. And then on the other side, they try to say it's the downplayers that are causing the issue. The people that don't believe it's a problem, they're making it more problematic. They're going to make it linger and stick around longer than it should if we approach it as a social issue that needs our attention. And then kind of within the kind of group specifically, you see people trying to stigmatize kind of anti-Trumpers, so it's not a problem. It's all these people against Trump that are trying to make it an issue when it's not. And then on the other side, people are saying it's all these anti-science people that don't get it, that won't listen to science And because they won't listen to science, they're going to make it a bigger problem than it really is, than it should be. So again, it's kind of looking at a current social issue and trying to ask the question, is it a problem or is it not a problem? And then recognizing the culture, the claims making, the conflict, and the stigmatized involved. So we'll leave that there for today. And what we'll be doing with our next class is turning our attention to our final chapter of the book, looking at collective behavior in social movements.